One of the things I love about summer is that it's a great time to play. The days are long, and I feel like there's more time to relax and experiment, and that's just what I did with two new stencils made up of simple shapes. They're great basics to have in your craft room because they're so incredibly versatile. And of course, I chose a hot summer color combination. Let's get started. Here are the geometric stencils I'm playing with. The first one is called Grid, and the second one is called Circles. These were both released earlier this week by Pretty Pink Posh. One of the nice things about Pretty Pink Posh stencils is that they have the names engraved right into them, so you'll always know what you're working with. And another nice thing about these particular stencils is that they were designed with card makers in mind. You can see that an A2 panel fits perfectly under a 3x4 grid of squares. But because they're bigger than a card front, you have a choice in placement, which I'll show you in a few minutes. And if you've been here before, you know that I love a 4¼ inch square card, and this stencil fits a perfect grid of 9 onto one of those panels. And we have the same fit with the circle stencil, both for an A2 card and a square card. My first background uses just the grid stencil. I've spritzed the back of the stencil with some pixie spray, which will help the narrow stripes stay in place on my cardstock. I also used some post-it tape on the cardstock to hold it to the stencil and some magnets to hold the stencil down to my metal workstation. When you're working with squares, you want things nice and straight, and it's easy to line the cardstock and the stencil up with the grid pattern on the work surface. Now I'm blending a partial rainbow of summer colors through the stencil, starting with a bright sunny yellow, then into orange, a bright pink, and finally a fuchsia purple. And when I remove the stencil, I get a lovely clean grid, just as you would expect. Now I'm going to shift the stencil a bit and try and create a tone-on-tone plaid by blending the same colors over top. One of the things about ink blending, the more layers you put on, the smoother and more vibrant your blend becomes. Isn't that neat? I love the little white squares that are still left. You could continue on and do more layers if you want. Okay, so let's move on to the circle stencil. I wonder if I can make a circular plaid. I line up the stencil over my cardstock and I blend the same colors through. Then I move the stencil so that the negative portions are in the centers of the ink blended circles, and I blend again. I love the layered look of these circles and the regular pattern of these little white bits that didn't get any ink. I'm not sure you can call it plaid, but it's still very fun. Okay, let's talk about combining the stencils. When I lined the stencils up, I noticed that the square and circles don't actually line up perfectly. This is because the border measurement of the two stencils is just slightly different. So when you have one circle centered in one of the squares, the others are slightly off, and they become more off the further away you move from the lined up area. This is fine. These stencils were not designed to be used together, and it's really easy to adapt, but it is important that you know so you won't be disappointed with your results. This next background is the simplest design, but it was probably the fussiest process of all the cards I made. So stick with me and you'll see why I thought it was worth the work. And then I've got a couple of simpler background designs to finish off, as well as all the finished cards. I had to do a lot of masking on this one because I wanted each square to have a different color in it. I'm trying out this hack that my friend Erica uses, which is to use some acetate to help with the masking. I've added some purple tape to the two ends so that I can find it on my desk, and it works really well, especially when you want to mask a straight line like I do here. I'm working my way through my 5 colors, having one square of each, and then repeating the pattern. I ended up creating 3 of these acetate masks, and one of the really nice things about them is they're reusable. Just clean them off with a baby wipe and change colors, and that's a little nicer than using post-it tape, which ends up getting thrown out. It takes some brain power, my hands, and the magnets to try and keep the masks in place, and I can see that it takes a little getting used to, but I do like the reusability of this idea, so I'm going to keep working at it. Okay, so I now have a nice clean grid of bright summer colors, and I'm going to layer each one of the squares up with a circle in the next darkest color. So for the first yellow one, I lined up the corner circle and then I put some of the light orange ink into it. Then I'm able to move the circle stencils and do the other yellow square while I have that light orange ink out. Then when I move to the light orange square, I want to put dark orange ink into it. I use a circle in one of the other corners of the circle stencil, and I do both of those squares before moving on. While it would have been easier if the two stencils had lined up perfectly, it's really not that hard to line them up like this. You do just want to make sure you keep your masks in place. When I got to the dark orange squares, I put the pink in the circles, and when I got to the pink, I put the fuchsia into the circles. But when I got to that final fuchsia square in the center, I had run out of darker colors. I got out a deeper purple ink, and wow, was it dark. These colors will all dry back a little, but I'm loving this look. Okay, that was the trickiest one. These next two are quicker, but still give stunning results. Again, I've got a square piece of cardstock with the square stencil on it, and this time I'm going to truly layer them up. I positioned the circle stencil so that the square lines are bisecting the open circles. If you look closely, you'll see that they're not actually bisecting, because as we know from before, the shapes don't line up exactly. But I think that's going to be okay here for the first row. But as I move down, the circles are not lining up vertically either, so this is going to be a row by row job, and that means I still need a little masking. I place acetate underneath my first row of blending, and then move the circle stencil down and line it up in the second row of squares, trying my best to align with the row above. Now I need masking above and below my blending row while I move on to the orange and pink colors. Then I move the circle stencil again for the last row, and this time I only need masking on the top. I put down the fuchsia ink and then put in that dark purple ink again, just near the very bottom of the panel. In my mind at this point, this was a vertical design, but in a second you'll see it didn't stay that way when I finished the card. Okay, now the final background, and I'm starting the same way with the grid stencil lined up on my cardstock. This time I'm placing the circles over top so that the crosses from the squares are somewhat centered in the circles. Again, they're not all perfectly aligned, but I think it's pretty close, so I didn't bother with the row by row method this time. I did a couple of layers of inks to get really smooth blends and vibrant colors, and when I removed the two stencils, I got this really fun mod-looking background. Now let's take a look at the finished cards. I used square and circle dies in my designs to keep the focus on the geometric feel of these backgrounds. I really wanted the backgrounds to be the stars of the cards. Simple shapes and hot colors are always a winning combination, and of course there are even more possibilities if you use different products and techniques. Here's a video where I made 4-in-1 geometric cards with a different color palette and dies instead of stencils. I'll meet you there. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.